What if I told you the problem isn't that they don't love you, it's that closeness itself terrifies them? Avoidants don't run from you because they feel nothing. They run because they feel too much, too fast, and don't know how to hold it. And here's the truth nobody talks about. They may reject intimacy, avoid deep connection, even push you away at the peak of love. But deep down, they crave things more powerful than physical intimacy itself. And if you understand these 5 hidden cravings, you'll finally understand the avoidant mind. Most avoidant individuals don't struggle with a lack of emotion. They struggle with what happens when emotion becomes too close, too fast, or too demanding. At their core, what they are constantly searching for, even if they cannot name it, is emotional safety without pressure. This is not the kind of safety that comes from being alone or detached. It is the kind of safety that exists inside connection, where love is present, but not suffocating, where presence is offered, but not forced, where intimacy is available, but not demanded on command. To understand this deeply, you have to step into their nervous system, not just their behavior. When someone with avoidant tendencies experiences emotional closeness, their internal alarm system often activates, not because they don't care, but because their body has learned to associate closeness with loss of control. Somewhere in their past, emotional closeness may have meant expectations they couldn't meet, feelings they couldn't manage, or dependence they felt trapped inside. So now, even in adulthood, the moment a relationship starts to feel too much, their system doesn't interpret it as love. It interprets it as pressure. Pressure is the key word. Because to an avoidant, pressure doesn't always look like obvious control or manipulation. It can be subtle. It can sound like, "Why aren't you replying?" Or, "Do you really care about me?" Or even silence filled with expectation. What feels normal or expressive to one person can feel like emotional weight to another. And when that weight builds up, their instinct is not to fight it. It is to create distance so they can breathe again. But here's the misunderstanding that creates so much pain in relationships. The distance is not rejection of love. It is protection of self. In their internal world, space equals regulation. Distance equals clarity. Silence equals control over overwhelming emotion. So when they pull back, it is not always because they value you less. It is often because they are trying to stabilize themselves internally so they don't feel emotionally flooded. Now, what they secretly crave is the opposite of chaos, but not the absence of connection. They crave emotional presence that does not demand immediate response, instant vulnerability, or constant reassurance. They need to feel that love is available without it turning into pressure, obligation, or emotional performance. When love becomes something they have to constantly prove, they begin to retreat. But when love simply exists without conditions being constantly attached to it, something different happens. Their guard softens. This is where most relationships fail with avoidant dynamics. One partner often believes that closeness must be created through intensity. More talking, more reassurance, more emotional digging. But for an avoidant, intensity without pacing feels like drowning. What actually creates trust is not emotional escalation, it is emotional consistency without demand. It is someone who stays steady even when they are not fully open. Someone who does not punish silence with withdrawal of love. Someone who can tolerate space without turning it into abandonment. When an avoidant finally experiences a relationship where they are not chased, interrogated, or emotionally cornered, their system begins to rewire slowly. They start to learn a new association. Closeness does not automatically mean loss of freedom. Love does not automatically mean pressure. Being seen does not automatically mean being consumed. And in that learning, something powerful happens. They begin to lean in instead of run away. But this only works when the other person understands one crucial principle. Emotional safety is not built through force, it is built through regulation. You don't pull an avoidant closer by demanding more from them emotionally. You invite them closer by creating an environment where they don't feel emotionally hunted. You become a steady presence, not an emotional storm. You communicate care without urgency. You express love without expectation of immediate return. And ironically, this is when avoidants become more emotionally available, not because they were pressured into change, but because they finally feel safe enough to choose connection voluntarily. Because at their deepest level, they don't want isolation. They want connection without losing themselves inside it. And when they finally experience love that doesn't demand their nervous system to stay on high alert. They stop running not because they were convinced, but because they were finally safe enough to stay. For someone with avoidant tendencies, freedom inside a relationship is not a luxury. It is a psychological requirement, but this freedom is often misunderstood. It does not mean a desire to be single, disconnected, or emotionally unavailable forever. It means something far more nuanced. The need to feel that love does not come with invisible chains, constant monitoring, or the pressure to become someone else in order to keep the relationship intact. At their core, avoidant individuals are wired to protect autonomy. Autonomy is their emotional oxygen. When they feel like their choices are being influenced too heavily by another person's expectations, their internal system starts to shift into defense mode. This is not a conscious decision. It is an automatic response shaped by past experiences where closeness may have come with a loss of identity, emotional overwhelm, or a sense of being controlled. So now, even in healthy relationships, they are sensitive to anything that feels like restriction. What makes this dynamic so complex is that avoidants often do want connection. They are not emotionless or indifferent. In fact, they can feel deeply, sometimes more intensely than they express. But the moment connection starts to feel like entrapment, like they are no longer free to think, act, or breathe at their own pace, their nervous system interprets the relationship as a threat. And when the nervous system feels threatened, the instinct is not to engage deeper. The instinct is to create space. This is why many partners experience confusion. One moment there is closeness, warmth, even vulnerability, and then suddenly, distance appears. The shift is not random. It is often triggered by the feeling of being emotionally cornered or subtly controlled. Even well-meaning behaviors like frequent check-ins, repeated requests for reassurance, or expectations of constant emotional availability can be interpreted internally as pressure. And pressure is the opposite of freedom. What they truly crave is a relationship structure where love does not require self-abandonment. They want to know that they can say no without punishment, take space without guilt, and move at their own emotional rhythm without fear of losing the relationship. In other words, they are looking for a bond where connection and individuality coexist, not compete. This is where most relationships either deepen or collapse. If the partner responds to avoidant distance with increased pursuit, more texts, more questions, more emotional urgency, the avoidant system experiences this as tightening pressure. The more they feel pursued, the more they instinctively withdraw. But if the partner reacts with emotional stability instead of escalation, something very different begins to form. The avoidant starts to sense that their freedom is not under threat. Freedom in this context does not mean emotional neglect or absence of care. It means trust in space. It means allowing silence without immediately filling it with anxiety. It means not interpreting temporary distance as permanent rejection. It means giving the other person room to regulate themselves without turning that space into a sultriness. When an avoidant feels this kind of freedom, their defenses begin to lower. Not instantly, but gradually. They start to notice that closeness does not automatically lead to loss of control. That emotional connection does not require them to sacrifice their identity. That they are not being trapped into someone else's emotional expectations. And as that realization deepens, something powerful begins to happen. They stop associating love with danger. The irony is that freedom, when properly understood, actually creates deeper intimacy with avoidant individuals. Because when they feel free, they no longer need to escape. They no longer need to push away to protect themselves. Instead, they can choose engagement without feeling coerced. And chosen connection is far more stable than forced connection ever could be. This is why the strongest relationships with avoidant personalities are not built on intensity, but on space combined with presence. It is the ability to be emotionally available without being emotionally demanding, to show care without creating pressure, to remain steady even when the other person pulls back. That steadiness communicates something powerful to the avoidant mind. You are not going to lose yourself here. And when that message is consistently reinforced, the internal resistance slowly weakens. Because at the deepest level, your avoidants are not trying to avoid love, they are trying to avoid losing themselves inside it. But when they discover a relationship where freedom is respected, not threatened, They begin to experience something they may not have fully trusted before. Love that does not require escape. Consistency without emotional chaos is one of the deepest psychological needs of an avoidant individual, even if they rarely articulate it directly. On the surface, avoidant people may appear distant, unpredictable, or emotionally detached. But underneath that behavior is often a nervous system that is highly sensitive to inconsistency, emotional volatility, and relational unpredictability. What looks like indifference is often self-protection from environments that feel emotionally unstable. To understand this, you have to recognize that many avoidant patterns are formed in environments where emotional experiences were not steady. In early relationships, often with caregivers or significant figures, love may have been present but inconsistent. Warmth may have existed but unpredictably. Attention may have been offered but withdrawn without clarity. Over time, this creates a deep internal association. Emotional closeness is not stable, and what feels good today may feel overwhelming or unavailable tomorrow. As a result, the nervous system learns to stay alert, scanning for emotional shifts, rather than relaxing into connection. This is why consistency becomes so powerful. Not intensity, not grand gestures, not emotional highs and dramatic moments, but steady, predictable emotional presence. When an avoidant person encounters emotional environments that fluctuate, one day full of affection, the next day full of frustration, silence, or emotional confrontation, their internal system struggles to find grounding. The unpredictability keeps them in a subtle state of tension, even if nothing explicitly wrong is happening. What they often crave, without fully realizing it, is emotional neutrality that feels safe. A relationship where moods do not swing wildly based on small triggers, where love is not suddenly withdrawn because of temporary distance, where communication does not oscillate between intense emotional expression and complete disconnection. For them, emotional chaos is not exciting, it is exhausting. It forces them into a constant state of emotional monitoring, where they have to anticipate reactions rather than simply exist in connection. Consistency, in contrast, creates something radically different in their internal world. Relaxation. When they begin to notice that your emotional presence does not drastically change based on every small behavior, they start to feel less pressured to manage the relationship moment by moment. They no longer feel like they are walking through emotional landmines. Instead, they begin to experience predictability, and predictability is what allows their defenses to soften. This does not mean they want boredom or emotional emptiness. It means they want emotional steadiness. A calm presence that does not overreact, overpursue, or withdraw unpredictably. Someone who remains emotionally grounded even when there is space, silence, or uncertainty. This steadiness sends a powerful subconscious message: you are not in danger here. Most avoidant individuals are not consciously analyzing relationships in this way. They are feeling it. Their nervous system is constantly interpreting cues, tone of voice, response time, emotional intensity, changes in behavior, and when those cues are inconsistent, their system moves into self-protection mode. They may not express it outwardly, but internally they begin to create distance to restore a sense of control. But when consistency is present, something shifts. They begin to trust patterns instead of fearing unpredictability. If communication has always returned calmly, they stop panicking when there is temporary space. If emotional responses remain stable, they stop preparing for sudden emotional storms. If affection is not used as leverage or withdrawn as punishment, they begin to see connection as safe rather than conditional. This is where healing begins, not through intensity but through repetition. Through repeated experiences of emotional safety that do not fluctuate based on mood or circumstance. Over time, consistency rewires expectation. The avoidant mind slowly learns that not all closeness leads to emotional instability. Not all relationships require emotional defense. Not all intimacy results in loss of control. And as this internal recalibration happens, their behavior begins to change naturally. They may not suddenly become highly expressive or emotionally open overnight, but they start to stay. They start to engage more steadily. They stop interpreting small changes as threats. The urgency to escape decreases because the environment no longer feels emotionally unpredictable. In this sense, consistency is not just a relational skill, It is a form of emotional regulation. For the avoidant nervous system, it provides structure where there was once uncertainty. It creates safety where there was once tension. And most importantly, it allows love to be experienced without the constant fear that it will then suddenly change shape or disappear. When someone finally experiences this kind of steady emotional presence, they begin to understand something new. Connection does not have to be chaotic to be real. And that realization is often the first step toward deeper trust, deeper intimacy, and a relationship that no longer feels like something they need to escape from. Acceptance without emotional demands is one of the deepest and most misunderstood needs of an avoidant individual, because on the surface it can look like they don't want emotional connection, when in reality, they often crave connection that does not require them to constantly perform emotionally. For many avoidant personalities, emotional intimacy has historically been tied to pressure. Pressure to respond, pressure to open up, pressure to explain, pressure to reassure. Over time, this creates an internal equation. Closeness equals expectation, and expectation equals stress. So when they enter adult relationships, even healthy ones, they often carry this silent fear. If I let someone see too much of me, they will want more than I can give. This is not necessarily a conscious belief. It operates beneath awareness. It shows up in subtle behaviors, pulling back when conversations become too emotionally intense, becoming distant after moments of vulnerability, or needing space after feeling emotionally exposed. It is not that they do not feel, it is that feeling often becomes linked with obligation. What they are actually craving, at a very deep level, is acceptance that does not turn their emotional state into a project. Acceptance that does not try to fix them, decode them, or force them into emotional expression before they are ready. Acceptance that simply says, you are okay as you are right now, even when they are quiet, even when they are uncertain, even when they are not emotionally expressive in the way a partner might hope. This kind of acceptance is rare in their lived experience. Many avoidant individuals have learned that when they are silent, others become anxious. When they are distant, others become reactive. When they are not emotionally expressive, others interpret it as rejection. So they grow up or move through relationships feeling like they are constantly being measured against emotional expectations they don't fully understand how to meet. As a result, they begin to protect themselves by limiting emotional exposure, not because they don't care, but because emotional exposure often leads to emotional pressure, and pressure creates internal resistance. The more they feel pushed to open up, the more they instinctively close down. This is where many relationships enter a cycle of misunderstanding. One person tries to create closeness through emotional demand, while the avoidant partner responds by creating distance to reduce pressure. What breaks this cycle is acceptance without demand. This does not mean emotional absence or indifference. It does not mean ignoring the relationship or pretending not to care. Instead, it means allowing the other person's emotional rhythm to exist without trying to force acceleration. It means being present without insisting on immediate depth. It means recognizing that intimacy cannot be rushed without triggering defense. When an avoidant individual experiences this kind of acceptance consistently, something begins to shift internally. For the first time, they are not being asked to perform emotional availability in order to maintain connection. They are not being punished for needing space. They are not being chased when they withdraw temporarily. Instead, they experience a relationship where their emotional state is not constantly under evaluation. This creates a powerful psychological effect, safety in non-performance. They begin to understand that they do not have to earn love through constant emotional expression, that their worth in the relationship is not dependent on how open, responsive, or emotionally available they are at every moment. And when that pressure is removed, something counterintuitive happens. They often become more open naturally. Because emotional openness cannot be forced, but it can be invited. When there is no pressure to reveal everything immediately, the nervous system begins to relax. And when the nervous system relaxes, emotional access increases. They may start sharing more spontaneously, not because they were pushed, but because they felt safe enough not to hide. Acceptance without emotional demands also changes how they interpret silence and distance. Instead of assuming that space will lead to conflict or withdrawal of love, they begin to see that connection remains stable even when they are not actively engaging. This reduces the fear of abandonment that often sits beneath avoidant distancing behaviors. They start to trust that they are not going to lose connection simply because they are not constantly emotionally active. Over time, this builds a very different kind of relationship dynamic. One that is not driven by emotional urgency but by emotional safety. One where connection is not maintained through pressure but through presence. And in that environment, avoidant individuals often begin to lower their defenses, not because they were convinced, but because they no longer feel the need to protect themselves from emotional overload. At its core, what they crave is not emotional distance, but emotional freedom within connection. And acceptance without emotional demands is what gives them that freedom. It tells them through experience rather than words that they are allowed to be in a relationship without constantly being pushed to become something they are not ready to be. Deep connection without loss of identity is one of the most powerful and misunderstood desires of an avoidant individual, because it sits right at the intersection of what they want most and what they fear most. On one side, there is the natural human need for closeness, bonding, intimacy, and emotional understanding. On the other side, there is a deeply ingrained fear that closeness will come at the cost of selfhood, losing autonomy, losing emotional control, or becoming emotionally consumed by another person's needs and expectations. For many avoidant personalities, identity is something they have learned to protect very early in life, whether through experiences of emotional overwhelm, inconsistency in caregiving, or environments where emotional needs were not safely held. They often develop a strong internal boundary around the self. That boundary becomes a survival mechanism. It says, I can care about others, but I cannot lose myself in them. Over time, this boundary becomes so important that any situation that threatens it, even unintentionally, can trigger withdrawal. So when they enter romantic relationships, they are often navigating a silent tension. They want closeness, but they are constantly monitoring how much of themselves they are giving away in the process. If the relationship starts to feel like it is requiring them to constantly align their frayed emotions, adjust their behavior, or prioritize the relationship over their internal world, they begin to feel a subtle but growing sense of pressure. Not always external pressure, but internal pressure. The feeling that maintaining closeness requires diminishing parts of themselves. What they truly crave is connection that does not require self-erasure. A bond where they can be emotionally present without feeling like they are losing their individuality. Where they can care deeply without feeling obligated to merge completely. Where love exists alongside personal space, personal interests, personal silence, and personal emotional rhythms. This is where many relationships unintentionally create friction. One partner may interpret closeness as increased sharing, increased togetherness, and increased emotional merging. But for an avoidant individual, too much merging too quickly can feel like identity erosion. They may start to feel like their time, their thoughts, and even their emotional responses are being shaped by the relationship rather than emerging naturally from within themselves. And when that feeling appears, they instinctively pull back to reestablish their sense of self. The key misunderstanding is that avoidants are not rejecting intimacy itself. They are rejecting the loss of internal autonomy that sometimes comes with certain forms of intimacy. They do not want to disappear into the relationship. They want to exist fully within it as a separate, complete individual. This means they need space to think alone, process alone, and maintain parts of their life that are untouched by the relationship. When a partner understands this and allows individuality to remain intact, something important begins to change in the avoidant nervous system. The relationship no longer feels like a space of emotional absorption, but rather a space of emotional coexistence. They begin to see that they are not required to give up their identity in order to maintain connection, that they can engage deeply without being engulfed, that they can be close without being consumed. This is where true intimacy begins to form for them. Not the kind of intimacy that demands constant emotional merging, but the kind that respects separation within connection. It is a relationship where two individuals remain fully themselves, yet still choose to come together, and that choice is crucial. Because for avoidant individuals, forced closeness creates resistance, but chosen closeness creates trust. Over time, when they repeatedly experience connection that does not threaten their identity, their internal defenses begin to soften. They stop equating intimacy with loss of self. They stop preparing for emotional engulfment, and they start to relax into the relationship in a way that feels sustainable rather than overwhelming. This does not mean they become fully emotionally merged or lose their need for space. It means they no longer see space and connection as opposites. Instead, they begin to understand that both can coexist, that they can step in and out of closeness without fear of losing the relationship or losing themselves. And in that understanding, something profound happens. They begin to stay. Not because they are pressured, not because they are controlled, but because they no longer feel that love requires them to abandon who they are. They discover that deep connection is not the same as emotional fusion. And once that realization settles, intimacy becomes something they can finally trust rather than avoid. Love that doesn't chase, but also doesn't disappear, is the emotional balance that quietly determines whether an avoidant individual moves closer or pulls away. It is not intensity that wins their trust, and it is not absence that keeps their attention. It is something far more subtle and far more difficult to maintain: emotional stability that stays present without becoming invasive, and space that exists without turning into abandonment. For someone with avoidant tendencies, relationships often feel like a push and pull between two extremes. On one side, there is the experience of being pursued too strongly, messages that feel overwhelming, emotional expectations that feel urgent, and closeness that arrives faster than their nervous system can comfortably process. On the other side, there is the experience of emotional withdrawal, partners becoming distant, cold, or unpredictable in response to their own need for space. Both extremes create internal stress, but in different ways. Too much pursuit creates pressure. Too much distance creates fear of loss. What they are unconsciously searching for is the middle ground between these two experiences. A relational presence that is steady enough not to trigger their defense system, but secure enough not to trigger abandonment alarms. When someone chases them, their nervous system interprets it as intrusion. When someone disappears, their nervous system interprets it as danger. So they remain in a constant state of monitoring, trying to predict whether the next moment will bring pressure or absence. This is why many avoidant individuals struggle in relationships that are emotionally reactive. If their partner becomes anxious when they pull back, they feel overwhelmed and retreat further. If their partner withdraws in response to their distance, they feel abandoned and become even more guarded. This creates a cycle where both people are reacting to each other's nervous system instead of actually building secure connection. What breaks this cycle is emotional steadiness. Not chasing when they withdraw, but also not disappearing in response. Staying present without escalating urgency. Maintaining care without emotional pressure. This is the kind of presence that communicates something deeply regulating to the avoidant mind. I am not here to control you, but I am also not going anywhere just because you need space. This balance is extremely difficult for most people because it requires emotional self-regulation. When someone they care about becomes distant, the natural impulse is to either pursue harder or protect themselves by pulling away. But both reactions reinforce the avoidant person's core fear that relationships are unstable and unpredictable. Either they are too intense or they are too fragile. When someone instead responds with grounded consistency, calm communication, emotional patience, and steady availability without pressure, the avoidant system begins to recalibrate. They start to notice that distance does not automatically trigger punishment or abandonment, that space does not destroy connection, that they are not being emotionally chased, but also not being emotionally lost. This creates something very important: trust through stability. Not trust built through emotional highs or dramatic reassurance, but trust built through repeated experiences of emotional predictability. Over time, the avoidant individual begins to relax, because they are no longer constantly trying to predict the emotional behavior of the other person. The relationship becomes less of a threat and more of a stable environment, but this only works when both elements are balanced. If there is only presence without respect for space, the avoidant feels suffocated. If there is only space without presence, they feel abandoned. The unique emotional safety they crave exists in the tension between these two forces being held together without collapsing into extremes. When they experience this balance consistently, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. They stop associating closeness with loss of control. They stop interpreting space as rejection. Instead, they begin to experience a relationship where they can move closer and farther, emotionally without fear of losing the bond. This flexibility is what makes connection feel safe for them. And once safety is established, their behavior often changes naturally. They may begin to initiate contact more often, stay engaged for longer periods, or become more emotionally available in their own timing. Not because they were pressured into change, but because the relationship no longer activates their survival responses. At its core, what they crave is not emotional pursuit and not emotional absence, but emotional reliability. Someone who does not overreact to distance and does not vanish in response to it. Someone who remains steady enough that love does not feel like a chase, and secure enough that love does not feel like it can disappear at any moment. When that kind of love is finally experienced, the avoidance system stops preparing for escape and starts allowing connection, because for the first time, they are not trying to survive the relationship, they are finally able to exist within it.